So, as you said, I'm Jessica Miller. I'm an editorial coordinator at the Royal Society and work across two journals, Journal of the Royal Society Interface and Interface Focus. And today I'm going to be talking about getting started with peer review. We have a number of journals which are mainly focused on the biological or physical sciences, and peer review is crucial across all our journals in helping to ensure that we publish reliable and high quality work. To begin with, I wanted to give you an opportunity to think about how confident you feel with some peer review terminology. There's no right or wrong answers. This is more for yourselves. There are some polls set up on the online platform. And for each question, please rate how confident that you feel you understand each of the terms that are going to be presented on the following slides from 1 to 5. 1 being you don't understand the term at all, and 5 being you'd be very confident explaining it. And you've got about 30 seconds or so. And the first question is, how confident are you that you understand the term transparent peer review?
Ten seconds left.
Okay.
All right, we're all set.
Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the second question, which is, how confident are you that you understand the term conflict of interest? Again, please use the online poll to rate yourself 1 to 5.
All set.
Okay, so thirdly, how confident are you that you understand the term single anonymous peer review?
All set.
Okay, and finally, how confident are you that you understand the term co-reviewing?
And all set.
Great. Do we have the results, or shall I go on to the
I will gather them for you and you continue.
Okay, great. I will sort of go on to the rest of the presentation. So to begin with, I've provided a bird's eye overview of the editorial and peer review process of a manuscript. And I'm not going to go through all the steps, but as you can see, if the editor deems it to be suitable to be sent out for peer review, the reviewers they select play a crucial role in providing a detailed assessment of the work for the editor. The number of reviewers required can vary between different journals, but it's often 2 or 3. Once the editor has received and assessed the reviews, they will send a decision to the authors along with the reviewer comments. The authors will usually be invited to revise the paper, although a paper can be rejected if the reviews are particularly negative. Sometimes an editor may have a tie-break situation where one reviewer has been very positive and the other has been very negative. In that case, the editor will find another referee before they make a decision. As you can see, reviewers play a very important role in assessing the author's work and providing feedback to the editor. There are a number of reasons that peer review is so important. First and foremost, the establishment and advancement of scientific knowledge relies on the publication of academic papers. This in turn relies on a robust peer review process. Therefore, peer review plays a crucial role in helping to determine the quality, validity, and reliability of a study, and ultimately whether it should be published in a given journal. However, the process is not always perfect. I will discuss some of the challenges in the peer review process later on, but the quality of reviews can vary enormously. In addition, different reviewers may not agree about the quality and validity of a study, which can be difficult for the editors. Sometimes concerns come to light after publication. Sometimes these are minor, but sometimes these are major ethical issues, for example, figure manipulation. Ideally, the editorial and peer review process would catch all issues before publication, but this doesn't always happen.
So I have your poll results if you'd like.
Oh, yes, great.
Excellent. So for transparent peer review, the mean score was a 3.6 repeated. The highest was a 5, the lowest was a 2. For conflicts of interest, your mean score was 4.1666 repeated. The high score was again a 5. The low score on that was a 3. For single anonymous peer review, your mean score was 2.6 repeated. The lowest score was a 1 and the highest score was a 4. And for co-reviewing, your mean score was 2.3 repeated. Low score 1, high score 3.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Hopefully, this webinar will help to kind of cover some of the terminology behind those terms and kind of clarify some of that. But that was just to sort of get everyone thinking. So I'll just sort of carry on where I was with this slide. So going on to sort of to think about whether or not deciding whether to accept a review invitation or not. So there are a number of things to take into consideration when deciding whether or not to accept an invitation to review a paper. And all the information you need should be in the decision letter or on the journal's website. You can also email the journal office if you have any additional questions or concerns. So firstly, do you understand the scope of the journal? Again, this information should be on the website. It's really the editor's job to determine if the paper is in scope, but it's helpful to understand the scope yourself. It's also good to understand the article type. For example, a research article should be assessed quite differently from an opinion piece. Then you'll need to think more about your capacity to handle the paper. First and foremost, you need to consider if you have the expertise to handle the paper from the abstract you've been sent. For some journals, particularly those that are interdisciplinary, you won't be expected to understand everything. However, you need to think about whether you understand the topic well enough to assess the paper and write a good report. It is also a good idea to familiarise yourself with the reviewing policies and guidelines, which should be on the website. There may also be a link to these within the invitation email. In addition, the deadline should also be in the invitation email. The time you'll be given to review can vary between journals. Overall, though, whilst journals want good quality reviews, they also want to return a decision to the authors in a timely manner. It is worth bearing in mind that it's absolutely fine to ask for an extension of a week or two if you need it. However, if you know you're not going to have the capacity, please decline. It's much better to decline straight away than accept and take much longer than the deadline. Finally, if you think you have a conflict of interest, then it's important to decline, or at least check with the journal office before accepting. This can vary between publishers, but it generally involves publishing or collaborating with an author in the past 5 years. Even if you think you can provide an unbiased review, publishers want to avoid even the perception of a conflict of interest. Generally, if you have any questions or concerns about whether to accept, you should simply get in touch with the journal office. As a reviewer, you should be an expert in the field of the paper you've been invited to review. Your role is to use your expertise to consider if the science is robust and well communicated. There are a number of questions you'll want to think about as you read through the paper. Some journals may ask you to consider if the article is in scope for the journal, but generally I would say that this is the editor's job. If the paper has gone out for review, it really should be in scope. On this first read through, you will want to see if there is anything jumping out as obviously inappropriate. For example, poor methodological choice. You want to assess whether the conclusions are supported by the results and how the article adds to the field, i.e., does it tell me anything new? At this point, you should have a good feel for your recommendation. That is, should this be published? And if so, how much work will it need during the revisions? When you come to write your review, it's important to consider the questions presented on the previous slide. We'll look at the format of a review form later on. However, all review forms will have a comments to the author section. The text you write here will be incorporated into the decision, and the authors will be asked to address the comments you have raised. It's important to note that some review forms will also have separate sections where you can comment on their data availability and ethics. If not, it's important to provide feedback on these terms if needed within the main review text. There's not necessarily a set way to structure your review, but I've provided a suggestion here. First of all, I would recommend including an introductory paragraph which provides a brief overview of what the study is about and how it fits into the wider literature. The second section will probably be the most lengthy and detailed. This is where you provide an in-depth assessment of the method, analysis, results, and discussion, and also recommend major changes. These can include requests for new experiments, additional analysis, questions that need addressing, etc. This will likely include several paragraphs. The third section should be reserved for minor changes, for example, small changes that would be good to address before publication. Many reviewers use line numbers to clearly reference exactly what needs to be changed, e.g. fixing a typo on a particular line. Finally, it's a good idea to include a summary paragraph to conclude your review and provide an overall assessment of the work. As well as assessing the content of the manuscript, it is also helpful to check whether the data is accessible. Some publishers, including the Royal Society, require all data to be made publicly available unless there are ethical or legal reasons for restricting the data. In this case, there should be a data statement which details where the data can be found, for example, within a recognised repository or within the manuscript and supporting information. It is helpful to check if the data is accessible and if it is sufficient. If you feel any data is missing, you should report this in your comments to the authors. Where data needs to be restricted, for example, in instances of identifiable patient data, it should be available upon request to a named Data Access Committee or Ethics Committee. If patient data has been used, authors should clearly indicate that patient consent has been obtained. Both animal and human studies should also provide details about the ethical approval and guidelines followed. Please also let the editor and journal office know if you spot any wider ethical concerns. This can include figures that look like they've been manipulated, examples of plagiarism, any obvious conflicts of interest, and concerns over funding, to name a few. How we proceed will depend on the situation, but it will usually involve putting the manuscript on hold and contacting the author for more details. We take all ethical concerns very seriously and follow guidelines provided by the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE. As I've just discussed, you may come across papers where you have concerns. These could be related to ethics, or you may simply feel that the quality of the paper is poor or not suitable for the journal. Different types of concerns can be raised in different ways. However, there are some general points to follow. Firstly, if it's an ethical concern, for example, figure manipulation, please email the journal office. They need to know so they can take appropriate action, which will involve informing the editor. Please don't simply email the editor without copying in the journal office, and you should always avoid emailing the author directly. If you have concerns about the quality of the paper that you want to communicate directly to the editor, there may be a confidential comments to the editor box in the review form. These comments will be seen by the journal office and the editor, but shouldn't be seen by the author. Finally, when you provide feedback to the author, it's always important to write constructive feedback in a courteous way, even if you think the paper is poor. Remember, it's helpful for the authors to have constructive feedback to address, even if it's ultimately rejected by the journal you are reviewing for. During the peer review process, you'll receive some correspondence from the journal office. They can see the bigger picture on any given manuscript, and a large part of our job is corresponding with authors, editors, and reviewers. You'll initially hear from them when inviting you to review a paper. Ideally, it helps to respond promptly, within a few days if possible. You should be able to accept or decline in the system, but if not, you can let them know by email. If you're unable to handle it, it's always helpful to provide a few suggestions for researchers you think are qualified to assess it. This helps speed up the review process for the authors and the journal office. If you decide to accept it, the journal office is your point of contact for issues outside the actual manuscript content. For example, if you need a deadline extension or you can't access the files, please contact them. You should hopefully receive a response within a couple of days. Similarly, if you feel you need to contact the editor, for example, there's a critical ethical issue, please contact the journal office. They can act as a go-between for the editors, authors, and referees for any given manuscript. If you accept the review invitation, you'll be given access to an online review form where you can provide your comments and feedback about the study. Some reviewer forms may be very structured, others will be more free-form. It will depend on the journal. Typically, review forms will include a combination of free-form and structured questions. Some questions are likely to be optional, others will be mandatory. Screenshots of part of the interface review form are shown on this slide. This is the place to provide your comments to the authors, a decision recommendation, confidential comments to the editors, and any other information required. For example, comments about data accessibility. If you have any difficulty accessing the review form through the online submission system, you should email the journal office. Once the editor has made a decision, the authors will have a certain time period to revise their paper. This will depend on the journal and discipline. The authors will generally be asked to provide a point-by-point response to the comments raised by all the reviewers. When you assess the revision, it is important to take into consideration the responses provided by the authors. Bear in mind that sometimes an author may not have addressed a request exactly as you wish. For example, they may feel one of the new experiments you've requested is outside the scope of the present study and would be better suited to a follow-up paper. They should, however, provide justification for any points they have not addressed. You should avoid asking for brand new experiments or complex analysis at this time. Of course, additional minor changes and clarification can be asked for at this point. We have also put together a dedicated resource centre for early career researchers that can be found on our website. This includes videos, blogs, webinars, tips, external links, and much more. Some of these cover peer review, but there's also information about developing your career, open science, and understanding the publishing process. If you're an early career researcher, work with early career researchers, or are simply looking for some helpful resources, we hope this will be useful. At Royal Society Publishing, we require all referees to have a PhD. On some journals, we also require that referees have published a certain number of papers. However, we do have a co-reviewing policy, which effectively allows those starting out in their academic career to gain experience. This means that for each paper, a senior reviewer is allowed one early career researcher to co-review the paper alongside them. The co-reviewer's details should be disclosed in the reviewer form. The co-reviewer has also got the opportunity to be included in our annual list of reviewers, giving them public credit for their contributions. Having a dedicated co-reviewing policy can help provide a pathway towards training and mentorship for the next generation of academics. It can also take the pressure off the senior reviewer, who's often very busy and may receive multiple review requests every week. Of course, the senior reviewer is ultimately responsible for the content of the review. The co-reviewer may also come up with fresh insights which can strengthen the review further. Peer review can sometimes be seen as a black box, where the readers may be unclear about why a paper is published. Transparent peer review helps to open up the black box and show the journey to publication. A number of Royal Society journals operate a single anonymous, transparent peer review model. The referees are anonymous, but the outputs, which includes the reviewer comments, editor comments, decision letter, and author rebuttals, are published with an accepted paper. The value in transparent review lies not only in helping readers understand why a paper was published, but can help reduce some of the biases that are present in the review process. If all parties know their comments will be accessible after publication, it is hoped that better reports will be prepared. Currently, publication of peer review information is mandatory on Royal Society Open Science and Biology in Proceedings B. For Proceedings A and Biology letters, we offer authors the option to publish peer review information. If you navigate to any article in the journals where it's mandatory, you'll be able to see examples of the published reviews. There are a number of reasons why it can be so beneficial for researchers to get involved in peer reviewing manuscripts, and why it's good to begin early on in your research career if possible. Firstly, it means you play a role in the broader scholarly communication ecosystem by helping to ensure good research is published, and you have the opportunity to use your expertise to give back to the scientific community. It can also provide insight into other researchers' work and the developments in your field. One crucial benefit for early career researchers is the skills it can develop in terms of reading papers critically. When you need to go through a paper very carefully in order to provide feedback, it can shape how you read papers generally. Finally, it can provide a path to more senior journal roles, such as an editorial board member. To be promoted to a board member position, you will need to have had quite a bit of experience as a referee and know key researchers in your field. Along with the intrinsic rewards that come with peer reviewing, there are a number of incentives that we offer peer reviews. Firstly, Open Biology and Biology letter referees are eligible for a discount token for each review completed. These can provide a discount towards any open access article published by Royal Society Publishing. 6 of our journals publish annual articles containing a list of reviewers who have reviewed for the journal and opted to receive this recognition. These can also be cited. Additionally, certificates are available upon request to confirm you have reviewed for us. We also provide recognition through the Web of Science Reviewer Recognition Service. This free service records, verifies, and showcases peer review contributions, which can be used in promotion and grant applications. The reviewer gets credit even if the reviews are anonymous, and the manuscript is never published. The review form provides an option for referees to opt into this service. As mentioned earlier, we also have co-reviewing opportunities for early career researchers. And now I'm going to go on to talk about some of the wider challenges in peer review. One of these is dealing with instances of unethical behavior. There are numerous examples, but for the purpose of this webinar, I'm going to focus on peer review rings, where a group of researchers collude to manipulate the peer review process by carrying out multiple reviews using fake identities with the hope of getting a paper published. There are a number of ways that peer reviews can be spotted. Firstly, review times can be extremely fast. There can also be duplicated text between reviews. The members of the peer review ring may also use generic email addresses to mask their real identity, for example, Gmail or Hotmail addresses. Last year, Hindawi announced they were going to retract over 500 papers linked to peer review rings. The Vice President of Researcher and Publishing Services for Hindawi said he suspected these rings consisted of reviewers and editors working together to advance manuscripts through to publication. Concerns were initially raised for one special issue. It was then found that these individuals had reviewed for other journals in the Hindawi portfolio, leading to further retractions. As well as the key signs that I outlined earlier, such as fast review times, the investigation also found misuse of databases that publishers use to vet potential reviewers. Overall, the technology and methods that can be used to manipulate the editorial and peer review process are very sophisticated, so it's critical for publishers to work together to try to combat instances where unscrupulous groups of individuals try to gain the system. There are a number of other challenges in peer review. Over the next 2 slides, I'm going to discuss reviewer fatigue and variation in the quality of peer reviews. Both of these are interlinked and in part due to the pressure on academics. Firstly, in some fields, there are very limited numbers of reviewers that can be invited. Sometimes a paper may have numerous authors, so finding suitable reviewers who don't have conflicts of interest can be very challenging. In addition, there are some fields that are very specialised, and it can be hard to find reviewers with the suitable expertise. This can then put pressure on certain academics in a given field, who may become go-to reviewers for numerous journals. Academics are also extremely busy and often need to balance peer reviewing with multiple other tasks. Therefore, academics can easily develop reviewer fatigue, particularly if they are frequently asked to review. Reviewer fatigue is also compounded by the overall publish or perish system. In short, since there is so much pressure on academics to publish, this means more academics are needed to review papers. One way that journals can address this is by ensuring they use early career researchers as well as well-known senior researchers. Some publishers are also experimenting with other models of peer review to address these concerns. For example, at eLife, all articles sent for peer review are published as a reviewed preprint, which can help produce multiple rounds of review. Other models of transparent peer review include those provided by the Peer Community In or PCI service, in which preprints are recommended by and reviewed by editors and reviewers in the open, and can be left at that or submitted to one of a group of journals associated with PCI for consideration for publication. Finally, many publishers have transfer systems, so journal articles that were rejected at one journal can be transferred with their reviews, if applicable, to another journal for consideration. Generally, this happens between journals published by a particular publisher. A related challenge is the quality of reviews, which can vary enormously, from helpful and detailed to very short and vague. There are a number of reasons for this. Firstly, peer review is carried out by academics who are very busy. Ideally, if a referee is too busy to write a review, they would either decline the invitation or ask for an extension, but this may not always happen. They may also have a particular bias, even if it's unconscious, towards the authors or the arguments put forward in the study. Advocates for double anonymous peer review hope that this could reduce bias. In other words, the reviewers will not know who the authors are, which helps prevent intentional or unintentional discrimination. Finally, they may just not have had much training or experience in writing reviews, and this will affect how good someone's review is. I've provided a few suggestions for how these issues can be addressed. Firstly, in some submission systems, there are ways for editors to rate referees, e.g. on the speed and quality of their reviews. They can refer to these scores if they receive another paper in the future that falls within the reviewer's expertise. As I mentioned earlier, it is hoped that transparent peer review can provide an incentive for reviewers to provide high-quality reviews. Editors can also provide guidance to authors in the body of a decision letter by including a short paragraph which highlights particular points that are crucial for the authors to address. Conversely, if there are aspects that aren't necessarily an issue, for example, concerns over the article type or scope, then the editor can also provide some brief guidance to the authors. Many of the reviews we receive are very detailed. However, here's an example of a very poor review. As you can see, the comments are vague, brief, and unhelpful. They also mention stylistic concerns that can be addressed during the production process. Before we finish, I also wanted to provide some links to additional resources that you may find useful to explore the peer review process. These include a free online course from Nature, the Royal Society Information to Referees page, some very detailed slides from Rebecca Sear, who also wrote some blogs for us on peer review, and finally, a resource on writing a peer review from PLOS. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to get in touch, please do reach out to us at the email address shown on the screen. And I'd now like to open up the webinar to any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jessica. A very informative talk. So to our audience, be sure you put your questions in the Q&A tab, and I'll be able to read them on your behalf. You also have the option of raising your hand, at which point we'll be able to allow you access to join us on stage here, and you can share your microphone yourself. To get us started, I have a few questions for you. So the first one was, how competitive, for lack of a better term, is the peer review application process? Is it a situation where you need 5 reviewers and you have none, or is it a case where you need 5 reviewers and you have 20? Which is the more common of those situations?
So it really can vary between manuscripts. As I said, usually we try and have 2 at least, depend on the journal, and you can have a third as a sort of tie break. I've seen some papers where, maybe 20 need to be invited. Sometimes it can be very quick, and maybe 7 or so to get those 2. So yeah, it can really vary. But I think I'd say if it's more than 20, 25, then that shows there might be a concern with the paper, and we'll sort of have a rethink at that point.
Gotcha. Following up on that one, has it ever happened that you've got a paper that was just so niche that you couldn't find that second reviewer?
I think if we were really struggling to find reviewers, and we'd need to sort of go back to the editors and kind of get some advice from them. As I said, I work on interface, and interface is at the boundary of the physical and the life sciences. So it's things like computational biology, biomaterials, epidemiology. And we do say in the review form, we actually ask reviewers to state if there are any aspects of the manuscript that they are not particularly confident assessing. Conversely, if there are what areas they are most confident in assessing. So particularly the journals I work on, we do sometimes invite reviewers knowing that they may not have the full expertise to assess everything.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Going to when you talked about those reviewing rings who were pushing through their own stuff there, that is absolutely wild to me. I mean, it doesn't seem unbelievable because people will, as you said, publisher parishes can be very competitive sometimes. What was the fallout from that? I've not heard of it before, and now I'm definitely gonna have to go to look to it. But what was the initial thing the initial response to that?
Yeah, as I said, I was doing this sort of. I mean, this hasn't come up actually to publisher that I've worked at. I've worked for 2 publishers, PLOS and Royal Society Publishing, and neither time I've sort of dealt with peer review rings. But after looking online, and we are, I mean, it's not just peer review rings. It's also sort of paper mills, where you might have a paper that's lots of duplication or manipulation, or just trying to get papers published as fast as possible. But anyway, with peer review rings, with this Hindawi example, and I know it's happened to other publishers as well, I think it's and I think for any publisher, the process would be doing more checks across other journals in the portfolio, looking at what's there, retractions if needed, and trying to strengthen the systems. I think in terms of ethics, in terms of checking for figure manipulation, checking for plagiarism, as I said before, sometimes it could be generic email addresses or lots of duplicated information in the reviews, and all these kind of issues that relate to ethics. Sometimes it's a case of putting in more checks. Some publishers have specialized research integrity officers who can kind of handle situations like this. And sadly, it is becoming more common. It's a bit of a race, really. I think publishers are doing their absolute best to try and put in as many checks and as many safeguards as possible to ensure integrity. But sadly, there can be, unscrupulous individuals who, as I said, will game the system and will use quite sophisticated technology to, get things through. So yeah, it is a challenge, the whole area of ethics. Yeah.
It sounds like it's not a situation of like a one single thing giving it away, but it's a lot of little things that add up to point in that direction.
Yeah, and sometimes it can just be, what one thing comes to light, or someone raises a concern, maybe an author notices a couple of reviews are very similar, or something happens, and then you sort of, it's almost like you pull the thread, and the more you pull, the more issues you find.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, as I said, whilst I haven't dealt with peer review rings per se, I have dealt with ethics cases, and sometimes it's very much a case of something doesn't seem right, and you start checking more, and then lots of things come to light that you're not necessarily expecting.
So related to this, we have a question in the Q&A. What's the biggest giveaway for a manipulated paper?
In terms of like peer review rings and or kind of generally like paper mills and that kind of thing. So I mean, I think in terms of, I mean, as I said, I haven't dealt with peer review rings myself, but if there's lots of overlap between several reviews for a particular paper, if email addresses just all look a bit strange, sometimes there are email addresses that maybe don't look standard, or but if things look a bit odd. As for a manipulated paper, as I said, sometimes if there are figures that look a little bit odd, yeah, there are all sorts of things in terms of manipulation, and we do have people running some specialist figures checks on one of our journals. I think I'd say sometimes if there seems to be lots of overlap, lots of duplication, I think that can, if just something doesn't seem quite right.
Okay. So I assume that just over time, doing this more and more, you'd get a feel for when something's off. You develop a gut instinct, as it were, telling you that that's not going together properly.
Yeah, or if you're looking at the kind of the methods and the analysis or the ethics, and you're sort of wondering, how this happened, and or you're slightly unsure, how they came to the conclusions they did, or they're making claims that can't quite be substantiated, or some of the figures may have been duplicated, for example, or sometimes the analysis, the data analysis may be a little bit off, or yeah.
Okay, fair enough. What's your take on things like ChatGPT, on large language models or other AI? Do you think that they would make it easier for you to catch to find problems, whether it is a direct manipulation or whether it's just a conclusion that's not really supported by the analysis, or do you think it's gonna make it harder to find them, or some other option in between?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be quite careful with ChatGPT. I mean, we've recently developed a policy about ChatGPT, which is very much along the lines of kind of, and more for our authors, which is very much along lines of, it can be used for, helping to phrase sentences, for example, but it certainly shouldn't be used to kind of, complex analysis or, tasks that really should be done by the authors. In terms of actually using it in-house, in terms of what we do, it's not something we've really talked about, and I think we'd have to proceed very cautiously. I mean, it's very different, but it's a little bit different, but what we do is screen a lot of papers for plagiarism. So we have something called Authenticate, and we can run that through again. And that's an example of technology being used to spot potential manipulation, plagiarism in this case, a potential ethical issue. So effectively, you get a report of the article and it highlights overlap, and then you can go and look at that article and see where there's the overlap and see the original sources and see how significant it is. So that's an example of how technology has been used to support, checks for ethics. So, yeah.
Gotcha. And then if you had, the genie granted you a wish, you could ask for anything you want, what would you ask for? What do you think would be the nicest thing to have in terms of making publishing better for everyone?
Better for everyone. Yeah, I mean, as I said, wow, that's a very good question. And I think there is this sort of model of, sort of publish and perish. And we know that academics are under enormous amount of pressure, and obviously they act as editors, authors and reviewers. There's also pressure for grants as well. So, authors will need to write a grant application to get the funding to do the research in the first place. So I think my wish is my biggest thing would be to kind of bring all the players in the scholarly communication ecosystem, from academics to funders to publishers and, publishers of different seniorities, and to sort of really think, what's going to be best for the scientific community, and also with the mind reviewer fatigue and academic fatigue, but also in terms of making sure that helpful science is published. I mean, I haven't gone on to talk about this, it's a little bit different, but some journals do publish now sort of null or negative results, and I think that's also important. So just a way to get lots of players around the table to think, well, publish and perish, it sounds quite negative, so is there a way to kind of make sure, take care of people's well-being and have research that's done collaboratively, and also that it's good science, I think, at the end of the day. So that would be my wish.